I used to live in a haunted home for 7 years. The house was 2 stories, the ground level and then the basement level of equal size. In the basement, we had my room and my brother's room, as well as the furnace room and the living room. It started simple. When you'd be downstairs, you would hear people running up and down the stairs and walking on the wood floors above you, vice versa. After a while in my room and the furnace room, we began to see these little figures. They were black, and you could kind of see their eyes, but not really. They would begin to move things. Sometimes junk would move on its own. These were always more darker than the backgrounds that they are in. As if that wasn't bad enough, we started to see tall human-like figures that were the darkest of dark. We called them shadow figures. In a pitch black room, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could see a shadow figure. They started showing up in the yard and trees, and they didn't really come into the house much after that. Eventually, our lives took a turn for the worse with legal issues regarding my grandfather who came to live with us. He was never a good guy. He used to beat his wife and kids and stole from everybody. He never took care of anyone. He had his own demon that followed him too, but I don't know if you want to hear about that. Anyway, when he showed up, he slept in the basement living room. He would pray on a regular basis for God to kill all of us, because he believed that we were bad people. When he showed up, the shadow figures seemed to follow him. They began standing in my doorway and watching me all night long, so I'd have to close and lock my door. Unlike the smaller creatures, the shadow figures given a harmful vibe. They eventually started entering rooms. My brother's was their favourite. They never went upstairs or crossed my room's doorway. But they did love my brother's room. They would stand at the end of his bed and watch him sleep. One night things got much worse. My grandfather was asleep in his bed, and I decided to put saran wrap over my brother's doorway to play a trick on him. It took me a fair while to set it all up. I decided to stand back and appreciate my work when I saw that there were 3 huge cuts down the middle of it. So I took it down and tried again, but once again they appeared. I decided to give it one more shot, and as I wrapped it up, I began feeling the tearing in front of me. I mean really slowly, like somebody was cutting it. I decided that I was going to wake up my brother and show him. As we turned the corner, we were stood face to face with one of these shadow figures. It was standing in the room with all the lights on, and it just turned around to look at us. I mean, it didn't have any facial features or anything, but you could tell what way it was looking. We ran into my brother's room to hide. We laid there for a good while when we could hear in the other room things being thrown around. After a few hours, we eventually managed to fall asleep. After this, the figures messed with my brother a lot more. I believe it is because we turned the corner, but my brother was face to face with one, and that's the one that looked at him. They actually started to attack him too after this. My brother had a friend over, and my brother took a swing at one of the imps and it disappeared, but when they woke up, they had bruises all up and down their backs. Now probably the worst thing that happened in that house was my brother was woken up randomly in the night by one. It was standing at the foot of his bed, and it screamed at him to get out now. This is the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. Here's a little background first. I'm not very religious, but I do believe that there are spirits out there, and there's things that we can't explain. I'm currently 23, and this happened when I was 16. It was me, my mum, my stepdad, and my 2 sisters. My older sister was 13, and my youngest was 10. My parents were building their dream home, and we were all living in an apartment while the house was being built. The apartment complex was really nice and in a great area. I remember the day we moved into the apartment. We were all unpacking boxes and trying to get everything organised. What really stood out to me about the apartment was how white the carpet was. Now the whole apartment was carpeted except for the kitchen and bathrooms. So anyway, about 2 weeks later, we were all settled and unpacking. The day went on as usual. I remembered it's time for bed, and my older sister didn't want to go. She kept coming up with excuses to stay up. I never really thought anything from it, and eventually my mum made her go to her room. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something rattling. It was coming from my sister's room. I ease out of bed and slowly walk into my sister's room. I opened the door and the noise stopped. Maybe I'm just hearing things, I thought. I then remembered walking back to my room and how cold it was. It was the middle of summer, and in the south it's at least 90 degrees or something at night. Our thermostat even read 64 when the air was set on 70. I shrugged it off and went back to bed though. The next day I went out with my girlfriend, who is now my wife. I left at about 11 PM and didn't return home until midnight. I got dropped off back home and went to unlock the apartment door. I then saw my sister sitting on the couch. She said, "Hey, when did you go outside?" I was confused. I said, "I just got home. I've been out all day." She looked at me as pale as a ghost. She said, "Eric, that's impossible. I just talked to you in your room." I just stood up and said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Yeah, you were just sitting in your room." Staring into the dark closet, I asked you what you were doing and you said nothing, so I left you to it. Now this really scared me, but I didn't show it. I just told my sister to stop messing around with me and I went into my room. When I opened my door, the closet was open and the light was off. I just turned on the TV and finally went to sleep at about 3 AM. A couple of weeks passed and one night my sister and I are out playing Nintendo Wii. It was around midnight by this point. She went to the kitchen and filled up a glass of Dr. Pepper. She walked out to the kitchen and stopped. She dropped the Dr. Pepper everywhere on the solid white carpet. She started staring down the hallway right behind me. What the hell? Why did you do that? Mum's gonna kill you, I said to her. She never said a word. She turned around and looked at me and said, "Eric, look over your shoulder, there's a man." At that very moment, my blood ran cold. I was overcome with dread. I could sense something was there. I turned around. There was nothing. I knew she wasn't lying because I felt it too. We cleaned up the soda and both went to sleep in the living room with the light on. My sister then told me that when she would take a shower, the mirrors would fog up and she would see a little girl writing something on the mirror. She thought it said "help me." "I'm okay, you convinced me the other night, but I'm not that gullible," I said. My sister didn't smile or anything. She was the most serious that I've ever seen her. This really scared me. A few days later, my parents had a funeral they had to attend and took both my sisters with them. I had the whole place to myself. I invited my girlfriend over, but told her to wait until I got out of the shower. I hop in the shower and about 10 minutes in, the lights dimmed a little. I felt this dread, like I felt the other night. I could see this man now. He had grey skin, a black beard and bright red eyes. I could see him in the corner of my eye. I got so scared that I just turned the shower off. I still had the soap in my hair and everything. I grabbed the towel and wiped the soap from my eyes. I swear to you, when I looked in the mirror, I could see the words "help me" written across it. I got dressed, called my girlfriend and demanded she come in now. I tried to explain everything to her as quickly as possible. She wasn't superstitious. She thought I was trying to scare her. I didn't want to go home that night, but my parents gave me no choice after what happened. That night, I tossed and turned trying to go to sleep. It was not working. I was wide awake thinking about what happened the day earlier. As I laid in bed, I heard the rattling noise coming from my sister's room. I got out of bed and opened her door, but this time the rattling continued. It was coming from her closet. I opened the closet and there was a shattered mirror laying on the ground. I remembered I put that mirror there when we had moved in, but it wasn't broken. How could it have broken? Even if it fell, it would have landed on the carpet. It weighed about 2 pounds, so it wouldn't have been enough to break it anyway, even if it had fallen. I woke my sister up and told her what was going on. She told me that she had been hearing the same noise for the past month. She was too afraid to investigate. Everything kind of calmed down after that. The day finally came, the day we moved out of that terrible apartment and into our new home. I remembered how happy I was packing up our stuff. We got everything locked into a U-Haul and left, not wanting to look back. I specifically put all of my electronics in a box by itself. We got to the new home and my phone was almost dead. I got to that box and started looking for my phone charger. I then remembered that my sister was using it when we were unpacking. Damn it, I asked my girlfriend to bring me back to the apartment to get my phone charger. This was going to be the first time that she had seen the apartment. I opened the door and she had a blank expression. She told me to get the charger so we could get out of here. I was just as ready as she was to leave. I remember to this day the coldness you felt when you walked in that place. I'm just thankful that I don't have to ever go back there again. I lived in a home with 4 girls and 4 animals in college. One night I happened to have the home to myself. This was fabulous because I had a paper to write. So I'm in my bed with my laptop and I hear a scratching at the door. It's the dog Miko and he's shaking and whining. As soon as I open the door, the 2 cats Ralph and Beena jump in behind him and jump on my bed. I squeeze in between all of them as I resume my studying. Suddenly, Ralph's hair stands on end and Miko starts to whine. Bernard's claws are digging into my legs as soon as I hear footsteps upstairs in the hallway. It's a pretty short hallway, probably about 20 feet, but the footsteps keep going. Now they're going past where the outer wall of the house is, into the neighbour's house. Miko starts growling when the footsteps turn around, and I hear them sprinting back in our direction. Then I hear a door slam shut. By this point my heart is racing, and Miko is barking up a storm, so I grab my baseball bat and run upstairs. When I get up there, I find absolutely no one. I had a real estate license, just to help family members. I created their website, travelled on location to take pictures before possible listing. I was a tech guru. Basically, I maintained and knew the equipment. There was this one piece of property. The only thing I was told before travelling with them was that the landowner had died and the family decided to sell the home. While I was attempting to photograph the property, with the adjoining field that contained a cemetery, I experienced all kinds of equipment failure. I knew it had fresh batteries and many media cards. I switched batteries several times along with media cards, but it all refused to work. The screen kept on reporting a camera failure or that the file wouldn't save. It was so frustrating. Now I decided that my only option was to rapid fire snapshots, no matter how many times the camera shut down. My 2 tag team member relator relatives rented a car and announced that they were leaving. It was a matter of fact statement. They were struck by silence. I said okay as we climbed into the vehicle, breaking the silence. No real estate banter as normal. As we were driving back and reached the bottom of the hill, I thought to ask if the property was being listed, and if so, offered to go back myself to take some proper photos. They told me that the family wanted to sell, but they were conflicted because as the elderly man was dying, he told them that if they attempted to sell the homestead, he would return to haunt them. Something happened there that they aren't telling me. Once home, I took the media card out and transferred all the images to my computer. Now there was literally only 2 images that I actually saved from my forensic session. One of them missed above an upright gravestone, and in another, there was a black figure in the tree line of the property. That's where the horses had been spooked earlier. It was dark, in a long coat, translucent, had horns on top of its head. Yep, I'm glad it wasn't listed, or at least not by our team. Apparitions, spirit, energy, whatever you want to call it. This ended up following me on a regular basis. Friends of mine told me it was a gift, but I'm not going to accept that. I actually quit the job since, and I've never took up photos again. Today, I shudder every time when I'm posing for a photo, scared that it's going to appear again. I grew up in a house that was haunted. We no longer live there, but my parents owned it for at least 15 years. Growing up, you would hear and see a number of things that were definitely not explainable. I once heard heavy footsteps walking around my house while I was in bed, only to have them stop on my door, and then it went dead silence. Multiple people unknown to each other saw a small boy walking in and out of a particular bedroom. Multiple different people saw a man wandering through the house throughout the years. My brother actually put his hand through him in fear and defense. After, he woke up another night to see him watching him sleep. There are some examples of what we dealt with. One day while I was driving home, I noticed an elderly neighbour working on a garden and decided to stop and ask her some questions, mostly about who lived there before and if they heard of anything. She mentioned that she'd been in the neighbourhood for 60 years but never knew who lived there because nobody ever lasted more than a couple of months. The original owners rented it for decades and no one would last after. She mentioned she was surprised my family had been there for so long. I did not believe in ghosts. Sure, I was entertained by the notion, but anybody who come out and stated that they believed in ghosts is dismissed as a new age hippie or whatever. Then I lived in a haunted house. It started out as little things. The bathroom door would open violently if anybody ever closed the latch. It was so often that we could count on it happening. I asked my roommate if he ever noticed a red light in the spare room when walking up the stairs in the dark. He did. I'd always go to the spare room to investigate, but could never find the source of it. These things I could explain away. The weirder things started to happen later on though. So during one night, I was sitting in the living room with my girlfriend and roommate when I noticed the shape of a woman's face on the window. We all noticed this. I tried to explain it away as a trick of the light. What finally convinced me that something was happening was one time when I was brushing my teeth. As I stood in the middle of my bathroom, something began tugging at me. There was nothing around or any source for this. Still, stranger things started happening. We'd hear footsteps upstairs while alone. I often saw shadows out of the corner of my eye. One time, I even saw a shadow while looking at it. Now, twice did I see this heading up the stairs to my room for bed. I would sometimes hear a woman's voice say goodnight to me over my shoulder. The strangest thing that happened was on New Year's Eve 3 years ago. My roommate and I were hosting a party and waiting for people to show up. Sitting in the living room, I suddenly felt something brush against my arm. The light bulb in the lamp went out. There's a few other things that happened and some I've forgotten about, but I'm sure as hell that none of these can just be coincidences. I've since moved out of the home, but my belief remains. Some strange things were happening there. My boyfriend and I decided to check out an open house in the neighbourhood that we wanted to live in. The apartment was everything we wanted. While my boyfriend talked to the landlord, I walked around alone, mentally decorating. I went to the bedroom, and there was a closet that took up one side of the entire wall. I stood in the middle of the room with an open window to my left that let in a lot of light. Curious as to how much space there was, I went up to the door and put my hand on the handle, and an image instantly flashed in my head. Have you ever been so engrossed in a daydream that you start staring off into open space, not really looking at what's in front of you? That's what it was like from the very second that I touched on the door. I then saw a man from the waist up, drenched in blood. He had no features and was barely recognisable as a person. I mean, he was completely skinned. I was only seeing muscle. I gasped and let go of the door, shaking it off as I opened the second pair of doors instead. There was nothing inside, but I said hello to the empty room. I then walked back to the living room. My boyfriend was talking to the elderly landlord, but I didn't listen to a word. I then looked down the hallway to the bedroom, and even though I couldn't physically see anyone there, I felt like there was a man standing in the hallway. He wasn't angry or happy. All I sensed was that he was curious. I felt he was curious about this person and why they were there. I wasn't curious about him though, and I didn't feel comfortable there. My boyfriend, however, was so thrilled with the place. I just didn't tell him right away what happened. I just told him that I was uncomfortable being there. That night, I had a dream that I was standing in the room. Everything was completely silent and black and white. It was sunny, just like it had been earlier. I woke up with my heart beating very fast, even though the dream wasn't scary. In the morning, I told my boyfriend what had happened, but he really wanted the apartment. We could take it. I was just being silly. I was with my boyfriend when he called the landlord. The conversation seemed casual, but at one point my boyfriend looked at me sharply. He hung up the phone and told me that the landlord said that since we were taking up the apartment, he was legally obliged to tell us that somebody died in that apartment. In my culture, if someone dies in a violent way, we should burn their clothes immediately. My uncle, who was a degenerate loser and predator, died in a fitting fashion. He was dragged by a car and thrown into a ditch. The coroner of the office released his clothes that he was wearing at the time. My uncle warned his sister and my mother and his wife not to look at them, but they got curious and wanted to see them. I followed them downstairs and they made me wait outside while they were snooping. While we were down there, we heard a smash upstairs. We ran upstairs to see a bunch of glasses that were shattered and nobody was in the house. My aunt and mother were spooked but didn't think much of it. Now this house was in the middle of nowhere. Our wakes are 24 hours long and somebody must always stay with the body. A family friend was leaving the wake and drove by the accident area. She seen what she was certain was my dead uncle, who smiled at her in a very unfitting way. We woke up the next morning, the last day of the wake, on one day before the funeral. My uncle was rattled, and I heard him tell my mother and aunt that he heard the crunching of boots on snow. My aunt and mother then come clean about what they did. My uncle said he warned them. They then started a fire and got rid of the body. He never bothered them again. From the ages of about 5 to 12, I lived in what I believe to be a haunted home. My first experience was when I was probably about 8 or so. I had just woken up as the sun was about to rise and my bed was directly next to the window. I sat up and peered out through the blinds. I then saw the glow from the sun starting to shine. I also saw what seemed to be maybe a 40-year-old man standing on the curb staring directly into my window. I was startled. I quickly pulled my head back away from the blinds. I sat there for about 10 seconds before I pulled the blinds slightly to the side to look again. This time, however, the man was about a foot away from my window. I screamed in pure horror and moved away from the window. My mother then come in, but no one was outside and the window was locked. The man looked slightly older and was wearing reading glasses. His complexion was white and translucent. He looked like a regular guy, but the second time that I saw him, his mouth was gaping wide, almost like he had a broken jaw. Now, a couple of years after I had my second experience, I walked out of my bedroom. This was during the night. I wanted to get a drink from the kitchen. The lounge room was in the centre and the kitchen was just off to the left. On the right side of the lounge was the front door. I walked down the hall to the entrance of the lounge room. My mother had left the light on during the night, so if any one of the kids woke up, they could move around easily. As I got to the entrance of the lounge room, I noticed that a figure was to the right of me near the door. It was a very tall woman who was walking towards me. I stood there frozen in fear as she walked past me. She went to grab something in the kitchen. She then turned around and walked straight past me and through the front door. As she did so, she did not take her eyes off me. She stared directly at me the whole time. She had the same complexion as the man. I could clearly see wrinkles on her face. She was very tall, maybe 7 foot tall. She had brown hair and a white gown on. I was fixated on her, and out of my peripheral vision, I could see what looked like a piece of paper that she'd taken from the kitchen. Now the way that she stared at me horrifies me even 20 years later. This was a sort of string of incidents that climaxed in one big thing that got all of us sent home for the day. First, the school that I went to was pretty old. It was built during the British occupation, and actually contained several secret exits and stuff. Certain parts of the school were permanently closed, which of course led to rumours among the students. My favourite was that a deformed kid lived there, forever shunned by the school. Second, we all witnessed a shaken, crying janitor being escorted out by some of the teachers. They were trying to calm her down. We were all told that she was ill, but the rumour was that she had seen something that she should never have seen in one of the stairwells near the locked area. Third, the ever popular toilet where all the boys went to secretly smoke. In the same week as the janitor's breakdown, there was a huge gathering at the toilet, and we saw teachers yelling at kids to go back to their classrooms. The toilet was then shut down. Why? There was a rumour that when one of the boys was coming out of there, he saw several wet long hairs plastered down on the wall. The grand finale. Somebody got possessed. One of the boys went into a frenzy and had to be held down. He was speaking in a very strange dialect that was quite alien to our area, and strangest of all, it was in a female voice. His parents had to be called as well as an ambulance, and we were all told to leave for the day. After that, the school got a priest to cleanse the whole school. I used to live in a haunted house. There was an old farmhouse in rural Norway that always had a reputation for being haunted. The house belonged to my ex-wife and her family. No one was staying there. It was her uncle's summer cottage, and we needed a place to stay, so we ended up using it. It was actually a very comfy place nestled in a valley. We brought our cat with us from America. When we moved there, I loved it. Everything was pretty normal for the first couple of months, but that's when the voices started. At first, they were indistinguishable, just muffled noises of females sulking. It was all stuff that was very easy to dismiss, but things got more intense. One night, the lights come on in the kitchen. We could smell food cooking, and there were women talking in there. Now, I should note that she had kind of a nosy family that would just show up whenever they felt like, but this was 3 in the morning. I was more angry than freaked out. I got up and headed towards the kitchen, and I started hearing voices. The voices stopped as soon as I entered the kitchen. I opened the door and went inside. The lights were still on, the oven was turned off but warm, the smell of food was in the air, and nobody was there. Things started to get more sinister after this. There were screams in the cellar and the attic, usually in the dead middle of the night, and the cat was getting increasingly agitated as time went on, acting like she could see things in the air that weren't actually there. This actually led us up to the event that made us move out of there. We woke up in the morning with the cat making this horrid howling, screaming sound in the living room. I go there to see what's happening and don't see her right away. It's then when I look to the side that I see her, still making this horrifying sound with her eyes glowing red. I then hear voices again. I tell my wife that we need to get out of here, and we left the next day. When my mum married my stepdad, we moved into his little brick house down in Texas. We were all getting along nicely. Me and my stepbrother were getting along well too. This relieved our parents, and we were pretty much happy. Except, I would start waking up in the middle of the night to see somebody standing in my doorway. All I could see was the silhouette of a large man with a large brimmed hat that would take up most of the doorway. It was so strange. I remembered it was all dark. All the lights in the house were off, yet somehow he stood out as a shadow. I could tell he was looking at me. He would even raise a finger to his mouth. I heard him go shh sometimes, and kind of let a little laugh out. It almost sounded like a scream. It's really hard to describe, but really eerie. It would never wake up my stepbrother though, and we shared a room, and he never remembered much of it. Anyway, I would always jump under the covers and hide, shaking, and just listen. I was sure that he was going to be right next to me, but nothing ever happened after that. I would never hear another sound. When I was brave enough to look out from under the sheets, the doorway would be clear, and I would lay awake for the rest of the night until the sun come up. Now this would happen to me at least once every 2 months, or sometimes once a month, until we finally moved away a couple of years later. My stepdad and brother both swear that they never heard or saw anything unusual there, but my mum says that on some nights when my dad wasn't there, she would just feel somebody crawl into bed with her. She said that once, she felt the covers being pulled and jumped up and turned the light on, and nobody was there. I'm still not sure what it was to this day. I'm just thankful that it stayed in that home and never followed me any further. The house I grew up in, and my parents are in denial of its haunting, is what got me into the paranormal. So many things happened as I was growing up for the first few years of my life. I actually thought it as normal. Now before I get into the activity, I should provide some backstory. My father told my mum that something demonic was attached to him. He said one day while driving, he looked in his rearview mirror and he could see what he can only describe as a demon sitting in the car with him. He to this day will not describe what he saw, but he told her at the time that he felt really bad about it, and he's always been running from it in a way. She firmly believes him, and we believe that he brought this entity into our home, and both her and I were targets of this. Now growing up, even my friends knew my home was haunted. Numerous people I had over would witness doors opening and closing. Every single one of them would feel incredibly uncomfortable in the basement. I remember me and my former best friend would tell my parents about a skeleton that lived in the basement. They thought this was just our imagination and would play it off as that. That's until they started becoming victims to whatever lived in our home also. Now my mum would have regular experiences with sleep paralysis, which in or of itself can be debunked, but not coupled with the most absurd and almost poltergeist activity with my personal accounts of what would happen to me. Not long after her first night of sleep paralysis, the alarm clock she kept by her bed would always fly off in the middle of the night and slam into the wall. I remembered hearing a woman screaming at the bottom of our stairs one night, and neither of my parents heard it. I was fully awake to this day and I still get chills thinking about it. Once I sat next to an unplugged fan and it turned on full blast. I would later learn as an adult that an old man had died in my parents' bedroom, which was a hotspot for this type of activity. Now hearing footsteps upstairs while my friends and I were in the basement was some of the most real and routine things that happened there. We actually called the police at least twice, believing that we're about to be robbed. I saw an apparition of a little girl and a cat sitting at my kitchen one day. I don't know how, but I somehow become instantly aware that the cat's name was Moonbeam, and from this day forward, on a regular basis, I would feel the cat jump up on my bed and rest at my feet, and I would always feel at peace during these times. Once when I was home, I felt a sharp pain like I'd been shot with a paintball gun. I was home alone at the time, and suddenly one of my dog's toys bounced away from me. I mean, something had actually thrown it at full speed towards my head. Now later that same night I was watching TV and it turned to white static. There was a big black X across the screen. I still believe it's plausible this was a cable glitch of some sort, but I've never had anything like this again. It was weird being paired with the other things from earlier. Now my parents at this time refused to believe me, and for my own protection that was. In reality, they were fully aware and having their own experiences, but didn't want to scare me. In protest, I set up my webcam to take pictures every few seconds while I went to school. And while no one was home, it captured a large red human-shaped face in the centre of the room. It was facing the camera. Even then, they refused to acknowledge it, but to this day, they remembered the incident. I remembered waking up in the middle of the night, suddenly hyper-aware that somebody was about to enter my room. I'd feel all of the hairs on my body stand on end, and I would hide under the covers until I felt their presence leave. This became a regular occurrence as I got older. As I became a teen and really started finding all these fascinating, I bought ghost hunting equipment and started using an old version of today's ghost box. And clear as day in the basement, I heard a deep voice call me by first and last name. Later I caught an EVP of two female voices talking, as if they could hear me, and wondered if I could hear them. I indeed heard the voices before, but couldn't place them. Now a lot of things have happened in that home, and I have many more stories to share. I still actively hunt ghosts and live very far from the house that I grew up in, but I'll never forget it. This happened quite a while ago. I'd moved into an apartment all by myself as barely a 20-year-old. I worked as a server 6 nights a week. It was hard work and long hours, but it paid all the bills. So here's some backstory. I was taking some time off my college after my freshman year after realising I wasn't quite ready for the responsibility, but I still wanted to be on my own and not in my parents' home. Now my tiny apartment was on the first floor and had huge old-fashioned roll-out windows in the living room, the kind you had to turn a little crank on to make open, but just a few other smaller windows in the kitchen and bedroom. I couldn't find curtains to cover the huge living room windows without spreading an arm and a leg to do so. Now this was located in an alright neighbourhood in semi-large Midwest city. Frankly, I couldn't afford a high rent, and I had barely any credit since I was so young and happy with the balance I struck. The apartment was small and had an old motel refrigerator and an ancient air conditioner, but the neighbourhood was okay. If you drove 5 minutes south, you get in the worst part of the city. The restaurant I worked in didn't close until 11. That was on weekdays and 2 AM on weekends, so I would always stay up very late, and the only companion I had was my cat, Edgar. I would usually come home after working and sit on the floor in the middle of my living room and play on the Nintendo for a few hours before going back to bed. Now it was one late night during the summer while I was playing Mario Bros when I looked up and saw a man standing in the window. My windows were fully rolled out because it was hot at night, and I'm sure this stranger had to duck his head under the rolled out window pane just to get as close to the screen as he did. He just started staring at me. I froze. Sat there not sure what to do. Now this guy was quiet for a few seconds, but then said, "Oh sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I just saw your light on. I live across from you. I wanted to say hi." I responded quietly with, hi? I still remember how scared I was at that moment. He was broad-shouldered, weak-chinned, and probably in his late 30s. No, I really didn't want to run away, because there was just a cheap window screen between us, and he was much bigger than I was, but I also didn't want to make small talk with a new neighbour at 2 AM in the morning. He continued with, "I'm staying at my buddy's place. They're away. I see your cat a lot. What's his name? I can come over and play with him if you want. Sometimes I see him at the window." Again, I don't know what to say. Now sometimes I left the window a little bit open, but just enough for the cat. I don't see how this guy was coming over or trying to squeeze through the gap if that was his intentions. "His name is Edgar. I have to go to bed now. Maybe I'll see you around." I was trying to make him leave. He didn't seem fazed by anything I said. "Edgar, that's a great name. Now I know what to call you." "Well, if you ever want to come over and drink or something, I live right there," he said while pointing to my next door neighbours. Okay, I better go, it's late. I'm tired." Him. "Okay, I know you work a lot. I love your cat. Come over sometime." Me. "Bye." He then leaves and I frantically roll the window closed. I turn off the lights and stand to one side of the living room to see if I can still see him. I could, sort of. Now his apartment was completely dark, except for the glowing cherry of a cigarette. I imagine calling the police and telling them that my neighbour just come over and complimented my cat. I decided instead just to close everything up tight and try and go to sleep. I was too scared to turn the lights off, so I laid in bed with the ancient air conditioner grinding away and all the lights on. That was until all the lights went out and everything went silent. My apartment was pitch black and completely silent. Again, I froze with fear. Did the guy cut off the electricity somehow? Was he on the verge of breaking in? No. I eventually pep talked myself into going and grabbing a flashlight and checking out the fuse box. Yep, the air conditioner that I rarely used had blown a fuse. I replaced it with a small toolbox of fuses that the landlord given me. The next day, I called the non-emergency cop line and told them what happened. They sent a cop over a couple of hours after I called. The policeman who come to my apartment asked me about all the details. I pointed out the apartment that the guy had come from. The policeman was very stern and scary looking. He told me I should have told that man to get away from my window and go away, and immediately called 911. He said he'd drive by my apartment the next couple of weeks. He's going to make the police presence known. Now this made me feel a little safer, but I moved away very shortly after this. I couldn't be dealing with somebody staring at me through my window at night.
Hello everyone, this is my first ever posting on Reddit. I'd had more than my fair share of creepy encounters in my life. Somehow, I always seem to attract weirdos and generally strange happenings. I thought I'd share a particularly unsettling recent encounter of mine from this past year. This all started last summer, in the summer of 2013. I had just turned 24. About a year out of graduate school and living back in California in my childhood home with my father and our dog. My days are mainly spent applying for jobs in the mornings, sending out my resume and cover letter online, and then heading over to a park for vigorous workouts in the afternoon. I found that keeping to the schedule was the most productive for me. I live in a upper middle class area of a large city, in an area with no sidewalks. Neighbourhood walks or jogs were generally out of the question. I was pretty allergic to the grass at a really nice neighbourhood park that's about a 5-minute drive from my house, so nearly daily I'd make the trek to a much larger park, which although was a good 20-25 minutes from my house and in a slightly more questionable part of town, it provided a really nice jogging track and beautiful peaceful scenery, including a man-made lake and various species of birds. I kept firm to this daily schedule during the weekdays, giving myself a break on the weekends. Being that my visits were during the daytime, on weekends in the summer, the park was mainly inhabited by older senior citizens, mothers with young children, and middle and high school age kids on summer vacation. Although I visited the park around the same time each day, I never really picked up on seeing the same people there. The park is quite large, and I really liked how uncongested the jogging path around the man-made lake was. Also, even though the park was in a slightly less nice part of town, I never felt nervous or in danger at the park. There were always enough normal people around, and I never went off into any desolate parts. As the daughter of a lawyer and the niece of a former FBI agent, I was always taught to be very aware of my surroundings, and usually pick up on details or if something seems wrong or suspicious. I never felt this way on my workouts at the park. I kept to myself, worked out hard, and then left. On August 24th, which happened to be a Saturday, I happened to be at home perusing the missed connection section of Craigslist, which I do sometimes for a laugh when I'm bored, in the M4W section. I saw a post entitled, "I have to tell the woman I see walking," with the posted location as the exact city in which the park I walked is located at. I opened the post. It was rife with spelling and grammatical errors, but this person essentially described me. My workout clothing, my appearance, the basic description of the park, what time I come to the park, etc., down to details including particular sunglasses and colour sneakers I'd wear. He mentioned that he wanted to know more about me and felt a connection. As I said, I never noticed anyone in particular at the park, and certainly no one who had seemingly watched me. I was very creeped out, but also, I hate to admit, curious to see as to who this was and how he knew all these details about me. The next step was clear. I was too curious. I created a throwaway Gmail account and replied to the stranger's post on Craigslist, not expecting a response. I was surprised when one came in almost immediately. I asked him several questions, including the specific park to which he was referring to and who he was. I was almost expecting this person to be playing some sort of prank. He answered immediately. He was in fact referring to the park I visited, identified himself as Mike, and then did something so incredibly scary I couldn't believe it. He attached about 7 images that he had taken of me jogging and walking around the park, spanning from months earlier to just a few days previous. The pictures were classic stalker style photos, sort of grainy, and clearly taken by cell phone. He asked, "Is this you?" I was starting to panic. I thought that I needed to play it cool. I watched a lot of true crime TV shows for fun, and consider myself somewhat of an amateur sleuth, and I knew what I needed to do. I wanted to try and collect as much information as I could about this man, and try to find out who he was, without revealing too much about myself in the process. I never confirmed or denied that the images were of me, but pressed on as to who he was, what he looked like, etc. He described himself to me as a 33-year-old ex-military, about 6'1" tall, in shape and fit, with short dark brown hair, olive skin and some distinctive tattoos. He mentioned that he worked in an office building near the park, and often took his dog there for walks on his lunch break. He continued that he was sure that he caught my attention several times, and that I would definitely recognise him if I saw him. He eerily stated, "And when I run, I slow down to look at you." I was trying to scan my brain to see if I had ever seen someone who matched that description, and I really couldn't remember anyone. Hoping nothing pornographic would come my way, I asked for a picture of his face. About 30 minutes later, I got 3. I opened up the images, and clearly, they were 3 completely different men, none of them really matching the description of himself he had provided me. A quick Google reverse image search had confirmed to me that he had sent fake pictures, and of 3 different men. 2 of them seemed randomly chosen, as if he'd stolen the photos off Facebook or some other social media, but the other was, very alarmingly, a photo taken from an online memorial site of an ex-military man who died under suspicious circumstances several years back. Now I was agitated that this creep was playing games. I called him out on sending fake photos, and he replied with his phone number, begging me to call him so he could explain. Now, I had another piece of evidence on the creep. Full of both adrenaline and fear, I googled his phone number, which gave me his full name, address and age. His name was in fact Mike, but he was 42 not 33, and lived with his mum. He lived fairly close to the park. I also searched for any prior arrests or evidence of criminal history, but to no avail. Being slightly too curious at this point, I decided that I would call him from my home number, which is blocked and would not show up on his cell phone. He picked up, and I could immediately tell that he was in fact much older than he initially claimed. I called him out on this, and he denied until he broke down and admitted he was 40, but not 42. He said he didn't want to admit he was old. I then called him out on his fake photos. He first claimed the images were real, then insisted on 2 of the photos were friends of his and the other was his brother. He made up a complete story of the photo on his supposed brother, which I knew was also a fake story, because his real last name, which I learned from other online records, and the name of the man who died under suspicious circumstances were not the same. Many other details didn't match up either. At my insistence, he finally emailed what he claimed to be a real image of himself. The man in the photo appeared older, portly, and what could only be described as greasy, sleazy, and just generally a creep. This creep would not stop talking about himself, bragging about his cars, money, vacation, houses, designer clothing, etc. Then, like a switch, he got really creepy. He started getting really sexual, talking about how he loves watching women work out in tight spandex clothing, and all kind of creepy stuff. I don't remember how, but I made up some excuse of why I couldn't text. I obviously didn't want him having my phone number. Before I hung up, he mentioned that he was meeting some friends at a Mexican restaurant, which was somewhat close to the park I visited. At this point, I called up a close, older male friend of mine, Bobby, who is a super intelligent professional lawyer, but also loves to joke around and is quite young at heart. He has always been confident, a true friend, and almost an older brother to me. I told Bobby the whole story and he was just as freaked out as I was. Perhaps we were both too curious to figure out exactly who this creep was, but we hatched a plan to stake out this bar and restaurant, which was pretty close to Bobby's house, to see if Mike ever showed up. The area was heavily trafficked, and we assumed the bar or restaurant would be very busy on a Saturday night, so we weren't too worried. Since hanging up with Mike, he had made repeated attempts to engage in more conversation with me over email, although I didn't respond. The whole evening I was creeped out, but also too curious. I drove to Bobby's house, left my car in the driveway, and Bobby drove us to the vicinity of the bar and restaurant. The plan was for me to wait in the car, which was parked around the corner from the restaurant, while Bobby would casually go inside and order a drink from the bar and see if he saw Mike. I had previously shown Bobby the real photo of Mike that he had sent me earlier. I definitely did not want to go in, see Mike and confirm to him that it was me, the girl who he had stalked and photographed for months, who he had found, spoken to on the phone and was now seeing in person. So, bad idea or not, I stayed in the car and was in constant contact with Bobby, who was inside the Mexican restaurant. I was in such a jumpy state, trying to stay calm, my mind moving a million miles a second, and compulsively checking my texts. Maybe 30 or 40 minutes later, Bobby left the restaurant and hopped into his car. He seemed very shaken and not like himself. He insisted we drive around a little bit and not go back to his house right away. Bobby is always calm and level-headed, and it was unusual to see him like this. When we finally stopped killing time and driving around, we went back into his house and went into his newly redecorated TV den to talk, so that we wouldn't wake his brother. This is when he told me the whole story. Bobby, as planned, had walked into the Mexican restaurant and gotten a seat at the bar. Surprisingly, the bar was not as crowded as expected, and was starting to clear out. Bobby said that what seemed to be a large birthday party was leaving, and he was told that the kitchen was closing, and there were only a few patrons. Shortly after he ordered a beer from the bartender, a single man came up and sat right next to him, and immediately started making small talk. This was odd to me, and the first red flag that this was Mike, because in the city where we live, strangers pretty much keep to themselves. It wasn't like this man was drunk and being super friendly either. Bobby said that the man was completely sober and didn't even seem to be drinking or eating. Bobby told me that the man resembled the real photo that Mike had sent over email, almost like an aged has-been actor, or an older, out of shape former bodybuilder, and that this man began gloating about his money, cars and houses, etc., just as Mike had done to me earlier on the phone. Bobby said that the conversation was really one-sided, Bobby only managing to eke a wow or an oh really in an as enthusiastic as he could tone here and there. Then, Bobby told me, like nothing, the man just started ranting and raving and getting very visibly angry over how he couldn't meet any decent women. Bobby's older brother, whom he lives with, and his mother, sadly suffers from mental illness. He has been around it his whole life, and is pretty aware of mental illnesses when he encounters it. Bobby told me that this man was very clearly mentally ill, as he went on about how he watches women, but things like that never get anywhere until he takes it into his own hands. Looking back, we both concluded that Mike was probably referring to coercing or forcing women into sexual situations with violence. I was completely sickened at this point and felt like I dodged a bullet. Bobby, disgusted and having heard enough at this point, told me that he calmly acted like he was tired, paid for his beer and got up from the bar stool to walk out back to his car, and me. Then, Bobby told me the worst part that honestly still freaks me out to this day. As Bobby was putting his wallet back in his jeans, Mike leaned in super close to him, point blank, and in what Bobby said was a calm, yet somewhat sneering tone. "You can tell your friend I'll be waiting for her at the park on Monday." Bobby had never ever mentioned me or any of the situation to Mike, and I had never mentioned anything of my personal life, including my name, social networks, friends, or anything like that to Mike. Horrible, ugh. After this, I stopped going to that park. I tried to forget about the whole incident. Mike had emailed me a fair amount for several weeks, alternating between seemingly desperate, yelling at me, and being intensely sexual and creepy and stalkerish. I never replied. I figured that Mike was truly mentally disturbed and would eventually leave me alone as long as I didn't provoke. I've dealt with some stalker situations before, and I really didn't feel like getting my dad involved and going through everything with the police. Also, I didn't feel like Mike was too big of a threat. I mean, he did not have my real name, my real address, any of my phone numbers. I figured that as long as I avoided that park, I'd be fine. Months went by and I stopped checking my fake email, started a new job, and pretty much forgot about Mike. I also got a new cell phone and a new cell phone number, completely unrelated to this Mike issue. I gave my new number out only to my dad, my new boss, and a handful of lifelong friends. I was very careful and more guarded than ever due to this incident. I also never picked up blocks or private numbers on my cell phone. Then, on November 26th, while at work, I got 5 calls on my cell phone, in rapid succession, from blocked numbers, with 5 corresponding voicemails, followed immediately by a call from a number I didn't recognise, with no voicemail. I didn't like to check personal calls during the workday, especially from blocked or unrecognised numbers, and put it out of my mind for the time being. Later that night at home, I remembered the calls and played the voicemails. The content was extremely unsettling. The man on the phone repeated the lyrics to the song "Me So Horny" by 2 Live Crew in various accents, said my name multiple times, and said some muffled things that sounded somewhat like threats and general sexual harassment statements. He also seemed to have great difficulty in hanging up the phone. Then I googled the phone number that called me immediately, literally a second or two later, following the 5 blocked calls and voicemails, whom I assumed was the same person. I stopped. Yep, it was Mike. I had known him. I'm pretty sure he called 5 times blocking his number, and then accidentally called again, forgetting to block his number, and hung up once he realised his blunder. To conclude, I have no idea how he got my new phone number, my name or anything. I can conclude that he may have picked up my name from listening in on a phone call of mine at the park months before, seeing as he was insane and unstable enough to think that photographing and stalking women in a public park was acceptable behaviour. I wouldn't put listening on conversations or spying past him either. But how he got my cell phone number is completely unexplainable. We have no mutual friends, and as I said before, I took strong precautions in not revealing any of my personal information to him. I have since blocked his number. Nothing has happened since November, thankfully, so I feel a bit more comfortable in sharing this scary story. I hope I haven't left out any details. I may have, as it's taken me a lot to sit down and write this whole thing out.
So this happened about 10 years ago when I was a freshman in college and had just started dating my boyfriend. He lived a few towns away from me at the time, and I was taking some of the back roads towards the parkway to get home. I had fallen asleep at his house while watching a movie, so it was about 3 AM and I was exhausted. I knew the way to the parkway well enough, but I was still not that familiar with the particular part of town. As you get closer to the parkway, you have to actually cut through a park to get to the entrance ramp. That being said, there were very few lights and the nearest town wasn't far, but it was totally out of sight. I pulled onto the short road and I see a golden sedan stopped in the middle of the road. It was actually parked in such a way that you weren't able to go around it without a squeeze. For a little background, I'm very small. At the time I might have been about 100 pounds and I only stand at 5 foot tall. I slow my car down. I'm trying to see if I can see headlights coming from the other direction so I can pull around him, but before I could, this man turns and runs around the front side of his car. He's waving his arms about trying to get my attention. As I mentioned, I'm a small young girl, alone, and it's 3 AM. There was no way I'd stop him for this guy. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look scary, but alarms went off in my head. I tried to inch up so that way I could pass him, but he literally stands in the dead center of my car and he's not going to let me go. I quickly locked my car doors, and he stopped. He starts trying to talk to me, and now he's trying to make his way over to my window. My hearing isn't very good, but he was so close to me that I could read his lips. He was asking me for help. He wanted my cell phone to call someone. I said that I was very sorry, but no. He then got even closer to me and said please. I said no again, and I don't care if I run his foot over. I just left. I was starting to get scared. I was able to just barely pass, but had to do it slightly off-road onto the oncoming traffic lane. I look in my mirror and he's just standing in the middle of the road staring at me. I could see the anger in his face in my brake lights. I pulled into the right lane. As I did, my headlights catch 3 men climbing out of the bushes. They're all dressed in the same black t-shirts and jeans. Now they're all staring at me. I could just feel the radiating anger off of them. I gunned it and flew up the road and gone to the parkway. I could feel my whole body shaking. What had just happened? What were they going to do if I stopped? I pulled out my phone and called the police. They had to transfer me a few times because nobody could figure out if I should be talking to the county police or highway patrol. When I was finally able to reach someone to tell them what happened, they sent a car over to check it out. I had asked the officer to call me back and let me know if they found anybody. He later told me that by the time they got there, the men in the car were gone, and this isn't even 5 minutes after I spoke to the officer. Then another woman called in, same story as me, in that exact location. I was advised not to drive over by the park at night anymore. I had no idea that it was not that safe at the time, and I've never taken that exit since. I used to live in a beautiful yellow house on the east coast with my family. My father moved us around a lot as kids, but at the time I was around 12 or 13. We were fixed to moving into this one. It was an old house. almost a century old. There was a lot of manual labour to be done before we could even get over there. My grandmother owned a home right down the street. It was a massive 6-bedroom one, and she let us stay there while we did the necessary work to get our home ready. The yellow house was naked and ugly on the inside. So far, the focus had been on gutting the basement and getting rid of all the 70s style wallpapers and shag carpet. Now by this point, all we'd brought over so far was some cutlery for the meals and whatnot. Now this place gave me a creepy vibe. The previous owner, an older woman, had actually died in the home due to her age. The relator was obliged to tell us that. Now as I was there, I got a twinge of discomfort when my mum told me, "Honey, can you stay here for a little bit? I have to bring your brother to your grandmother. The doors are all locked, just lock the one behind me." I'm not sure how long it took for what happened to happen between then and my mother leaving, but it had to be 20 minutes or so. My grandmother wasn't very far, but my mother loved to talk, so the simplest visit could take an hour. I was in the kitchen when a man drove into the driveway and used a key to get into the front door and walked in. He was about mid-40s, but possibly younger, with this terrible hygiene. When I first saw him, I was like a deer in headlights. I'll never forget the first words he said. "It's okay, my grandma used to live here, you look so afraid, it's okay," as he was inching into my apartment. With some quick thinking, I grabbed a little knife from my cutlery drawer and hid it behind my back, praying I wouldn't have to use it. I didn't know how to. "No, this is my house, you can't be here." He ignored me. "Just over there is where we kept all the Christmas trees," he said, pointing towards the living room. "And that's a hell of a stove. I used to use it all the time." Still getting closer into the house by this point, inch by inch. I wanted to cry. I wanted to pull out my phone and call my mum to come back. I wanted my mum to pull into the driveway. I flashed a knife. "Get out or I'm calling the cops." He put his hands up like he surrendered. He then backed out the way that he'd come from. He then said, "Thanks for your time," as he walked away. I then burst into tears as he driven off, unsure of what to say or what happened. I called my mum and she of course went insane. I don't know if this guy was actually an old resident of the home or if he had worse intentions. Either way, he scared the life out of me and I was never the same after. The town I grew up in had an old sanitarium. It closed down in the late 60s, but the building was still there. In high school, everyone and their mum tried breaking in. Some succeeded, but others chickened out. After high school and a stint in the Marines, I found myself working private security, and what we mostly did was guard construction projects at night. Well, the sanitarium was slated for demo, and the company that bought the land planned on turning it into an apartment complex. So there was myself and this other guy named Fred. He had to be pushing 70. So we're working one night. Fred was a former cop from Chicago, and before that was a Marine. We often swapped stories and really enjoyed working together. The sanitarium was a hotbed for homeless and drug activity, and we often had to chase tweakers and homeless folks off the property. So that night, Fred and I were shooting the shit when he stops me and tells me that there's somebody just over there by the fence. So we get out and head inside. Now it's important to note that Fred was unarmed. All I had was my side piece. We also had pepper spray, a stun gun and a baton. So we're heading after this guy who was wearing all black and wasn't responding to our commands to stop. We hear glass breaking and realise that this guy must have broken into the old administrative offices. We have keys to the doors, but the locks are old and it takes us a few minutes to get through. Now our protocol at the time was to call dispatch to advise them on a foot chase. So that's what Fred did, as I swept the rooms with my flashlight and gun. I'm calling out this dude and I hear an evil cackle. It sent a jolt of dread throughout my body. Fred had turned white. I start pleading with this guy to show himself, telling him that the company called the police, which we didn't. Now, the laughing is coming from behind us, and it's not just one voice, it sounds like several voices. Fred literally pisses himself, he's terrified, and this is a non-veteran and former cop. Fred and I turn to leave and I hear what sounds like footsteps. Then, the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. I grab Fred and we run for it. As we do, there's more maniacal laughing. The cops finally show up and do a search, but dispatch couldn't reach us and called it in. They go in and find the 3 guys. All 3 are armed, one with a gun, one with a homemade shiv, and the other with a lead pipe. If we hadn't run, who knows what could have happened to us. The hotel I worked at was small, only 53 rooms to the entire place. It's located next to downtown, in a town in central Minnesota. As a night audit, you work by yourself, with the shift being from 11 PM to 7 AM. You don't get many people checking into the hotel at night, 1 or 3 at most. The first duty as night audit was to lock the doors, so only guests with keys can get in. There's also a phone on the wall next to the main entrance in case somebody arrives after the doors are locked, or if somebody orders pizza or something. Now there is a front door in the lobby, a back door in the lobby, and 2 side doors. I proceed to lock all of the doors and head into the back room behind the front desk to do laundry. That's because there's no staff to do the laundry. There is a cordless phone you can bring with you when going into the back or around other parts of the hotel. We had no more scheduled check-ins that night, but there was a couple of rooms available. I heard somebody try and open the front door, was unsuccessful and left. A few moments later, the phone rang, and when I answered, the other person didn't talk right away. I walked up to the front desk and the other person finally started talking. They went on a weird spree saying that they're a former cop and something about having court in the morning, and that if they weren't let in, they were going to come in and shoot me, and they were circling the hotel. Now the scary part for me is that there is a window that's visible from where I am, right in front of the computer, so if he wanted to take a shot at me, he could easily do it through that. I then told him that, sorry, there's no available rooms, and they quickly hung up before I even finished the sentence. I looked out of the window and there was a person standing across the street staring back at me with a phone in their hand. At this point I'm really freaking out and I go to all the doors to double check that they're locked. It was a good thing I checked because one of the side doors had been propped open with a doorstop. Obviously I shut it and proceeded to go to the conference room. I was quiet in this and I kept all the lights off and peeked through the blinds. After a few hours, this person eventually left me. I was worried the rest of the night because there were windows everywhere, so this person could have easily broken in if they had figured out how to climb up to get to me. Luckily, they never did though, and I'm alive today. I still don't know what they wanted, but it scares the hell out of me. I have always had an innate fear of night, not so much the dark, but night itself. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night, and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on until one night I decided to go out with a buddy of mine to a baseball game. Of course that night the game went into extra innings, so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 AM. Everything was fine on the way home until I hit a light right before the street that led to my home. It's at a T-junction, so I was turning left. The light is one of those that you think is broken until it finally turns green when you decide just to run it. Of course I pulled up just as the light turned red. I would have just run the light, seeing as nobody else was there and it was almost 2 AM on a school night, but earlier that week I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason I decided to stay there. I pulled up to the stoplight feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window to my left and I noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact and I quickly looked away, but it was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision and knew she was coming my way. I looked out of the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quietly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator, just in case I had to brace myself for what was to come. I was hoping it would be just an awkward exchange and was praying for a quick light change before she reacted to me, so that way I could get out of there, but I knew there was a slim chance of that happening. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag and began tapping on my window. I nervously looked up at her and she motioned for me to put my window down. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing too hard on the window button and that thing coming all the way down. So I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it. It moved down a tiny bit, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then began to speak and leaned in. My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Give me a ride, yeah? I'll quickly give a description of the bag lady. She was skinny and small. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a really hard 20 years on the street, or was 60-something who lived a moderately hard street life. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, not just by her boyfriend, but there was something about her delivery. It was robotic, like it was practiced, and she was disconnected from the moment, and it made my skin crawl. After a brief second, I debated on what I should do or not. I told her that I had to go home and couldn't give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in closer and said again, "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you please give me a ride?" This time I felt more confident when I declined her to give her a ride. I told her I had a curfew and had to get home. She then leaned in for a third time and began her statement again. "My boyfriend beat me." At this point the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake and started slowly rolling forward and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, then looked down at me, then leaned in closer and said 5 words that will haunt me for the rest of my life. "You made the right decision." She then picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she planned to do or if there were other people waiting to jump me from the bushes, but thank God I made the right decision. I was 17 and lived with my parents in a very remote location in a small town in the middle of a forest. There were no neighbours, just forest. At some point in September, these flashlights started appearing and they are pointing at our windows. Sometimes it was 2, but mostly it is just one of them. We never bothered to call the police or anyone because we thought it was just some kids or some guy that had nothing else better to do, and they never really touched anything, just flashed our windows and knocked on them. It was definitely creepy, but after a few weeks of going outside and even waiting for them to appear, they were never out there, so we just got used to it. They weren't like regular. Sometimes there was a couple of days between them, or even weeks. This encounter happened just a few days after Christmas. My parents were visiting relatives at the time, so it was just me in. At 11 PM, I decided to go shower. Now, our shower was in a separate building, so I had to walk across the yard to get to the shower. Nothing out of the ordinary happens in the shower, but as I'm walking across the yard with just a towel on me, I hear a man behind me say, "You know, I can catch you if you run." At that point, I just wanted to cry for mum, but I just kept walking like I haven't even noticed the guy. The door was unlocked since I was too lazy to carry the keys. I just slam the door behind me and lock it, grab a knife from the lobby. I go through the house checking every single possible hiding spot. Luckily no one was there. After the incident, there were no more flashlights or anything creepy. I didn't call the police, but I informed them. I never got to know why the guy was standing there and why he was watching me. He clearly wasn't there for anything violent, or was he? It was February 2010. I was 7 years old. My mum would let me walk home from school as my apartment was just a little way from school. There was never any problems, but one day when I was walking home from school, a black car pulled up next to me. For the life of me, I can't remember what car it was. The window of the car rolled down, and there was a woman with red hair next to me. She looked to be about 45. She introduced herself as Erica and said that she was my dad's sister. My father left before I was born, and we never had any contact. Although I didn't know much about my father at the time, I did know that he only had brothers. So, instead of telling Erica that I didn't have any sisters or just walking away, I told her my name, and she started asking me questions like, "What school do you go? How old's your brother? Who is your brother?" I got really creeped out by these questions and told her that I wasn't supposed to be talking to strangers and started walking away. She continued to drive slowly next to me and kept saying that she means no harm, and I got scared and started running, and she followed me. When I got into my apartment complex, I ran up to my neighbour's house acting like it is mine because that's what my brother told me to do if I ever got followed home. I looked back when I was at the door and she was driving away. I didn't tell my mum because I didn't want her to stop me from walking home alone. The next day it happened again, but this time she offered me a ride. I told her no and to leave me alone, and once again I started running over to the neighbour's house, and once again she followed me. I still didn't tell my mum. The next day was Saturday, and I was playing at the basketball court with my brother when I saw a car drive by and dragged my brother inside to tell him that I felt sick. On the Sunday after church, on the way home, the car pulled into the complex and I saw her outside. She wasn't in her car though. I remembered that she had a big stomach and smaller legs. I got really scared when she jumped out of the car, and I ran inside and looked out the living room window while my mum and brother went to make lunch. I saw her walk over to my neighbour's house that I ran to. A few moments later, she walked away, and my neighbour came over to the house and informed my mother that a lady claiming that she was a teacher was looking for me and needed something. When my mum heard this, she called me inside and I started crying and told her what happened. She then started crying too, and she told me that I had to wait for my brother, who was 13, to get out of school so we could walk home together. Then she reported it to the police. Myself and my neighbour given a report. After that, I saw the car and I would point it out to my brother and we would tell my mum. It all died down by April. We never got anything back from the police. Now, I did not see her for years and years, and I've forgotten all about it until yesterday, when I went somewhere with my friend. I felt a tap on my shoulder and it was her. She introduces herself again and my mouth was just hung open in shock. I acted nice, but when she offered to take me to her home, I got scared and ran away. I'm very afraid. She still remembers me and she's still trying to get me.
It started in a haunted cave on Halloween. Just me and my friend Anna. Me and Anna are total opposites. She's blonde, outgoing, and completely fearless. I'm dark-haired, introverted, a people-pleaser. That's exactly how I ended up at this cave. People-pleasing. Anyway. We go through the cave, and it was pretty awesome. The usual people, chainsaws, screamers, clowns. One clown kept following us. He wasn't like the other clowns, who wore face paint with fake blood splattered on them. He didn't even have a big red nose and a clown suit. He had on regular, if not tattered jeans, a stained, sweaty white tee, and a clown mask. The mask was pretty detailed. It had the eyes cut out and a wicked jagged tooth mouth with blood smeared around it. It was seriously creepy. He followed us all the way through the house as we giggled and ran until the fog room at the end. Once we made it outside, we go get Coco and watch the local bands play. While in the line, the clown walks up and stands inches away from me, breathing in and out so hard his mask sticks to his face and releases with each breath. Okay, creepy, but normal for this place. He walks away, we giggle, but he stays close staring. We walk over to the band and he stands right behind me. He starts tugging on my hair. I ignore it, but he tugs harder. Suddenly he pulls my head so hard it whips back. Anna starts yelling at him and he lets go and walks away, but like before, not too far away. She wanted to tell someone, but I didn't. We were at a haunted cave, he probably didn't mean to. But she said no, they can't touch you, and we walked over to the ticket booth to complain. It went like this. Anna: "Mum, your clown over there just pulled my friend's hair so hard it almost ripped out." Ticket lady: "I don't see any of our clowns, they are all in the cave. None of our people walk around out here, they're all behind that rope, because some families with small kids come for the hayride and bands." Anna: "That clown there did it, do you not see him?" Ticket lady: "Calm down, miss. This is not one of our clowns. Are you sure he isn't a friend of yours?" Me: Thank you, we're so sorry. So I just want to leave. The clown's still staring. I'm missing hair. This isn't fun. Fearless Anna decides to confront the clown. She marches right up with me behind her and demands he takes off his mask. He doesn't speak, he just looks at me. He reaches his hand out to me and I refuse to touch him. He pushed Anna from in front of me and stepped 2 inches from my face and screamed the most terrifying psychotic scream I've ever heard. Everyone turned to look. The band stopped playing. Then Anna kind of grabbed my arm and slapped me and we ran. I looked behind and he was standing, staring. Everyone went back to what they were doing like it was nothing. We got in the car and peeled out. Anna kept saying we needed the police and we need to speak to them now. I told her it wasn't that big a deal and it was just a weirdo at a haunted cave. No hard feelings for the slap. To be honest, I was too scared. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. He had a knife. That's why she slapped me and pulled me away. Not from the fear of being screamed at. She saw the knife in his hand. We contacted the police, but they didn't take us seriously. I'm now afraid to go to haunted attractions. Not because they're scary, but you never really know if someone works there and they're out to get you.
My brother and I were watching TV when we heard somebody climbing the wall of our backyard and jumping in. We got up and headed straight away to the kitchen. I was very afraid and me and my brother didn't know what to do. We started to hear him knocking at our door and saying that we had to open up. My door is very fragile and I was worried that he was going to break through. I picked up a knife and said to my brother to open the door. I know it sounds stupid, but our plan was to scare him. I gathered the courage left in my body and just shouted and ran after him. Fortunately this worked and he never climbed the wall again and did go away. This all took place when I was 13 and my brother was 12. Our parents weren't home at the time and we just couldn't sleep after this happened. After 40 minutes our parents arrived back and we explained everything to them. They called the cops and I didn't sleep for a month or so properly after this. This happened almost 2 years ago. It was around 2 in the morning during the summer and I was asleep. My blinds were cracked, but my room was on the 2nd floor of the home. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating against my pillow. The moon was shining through the blinds, dimly lighting up half of my room and the other half in the dark. It read no caller ID. I don't remember why, but I felt like I needed to answer it, so I mumbled hello. A man's voice I didn't recognise replied after a solid few seconds of silence. "Are you alone?" I didn't think of anything I could say at the time. I didn't say or do anything for a few minutes, or at least it felt like it. I really couldn't think of who was calling me. It was slow and grumbly. He sounded like he was moving. Finally, I said no and hung up. Seconds later, I heard the doggy door downstairs open. You all know the sound, but imagine that slowed down. My dog was in my bed, now moving towards me as I'd woken him up. I then began to hear the doggy door close very slowly. I then sat up in unsettling silence, waited for the sound of footsteps. Nothing. A few minutes later, I slowly got out of bed and made my way to the window which overlooked the backyard. From there, I could see the back gate on the side of the house. It was slightly ajar. I stood and stared at it, unsure what to do. I quietly went downstairs, ready to face whatever or whoever entered my home. But the back door was shut and locked. Now in order to go through the doggy door, the back door has to be open. This gave me some relief, but I was still unsettled that somebody had tried to enter my home. To the man who tried to break in, I have no idea who you are. I just don't want you to call me again. Just leave me. So this happened about 10 years ago when I was a freshman in college and had just started dating my boyfriend. He lived a few towns away from me at the time, and I was taking some of the back roads towards the parkway to get home. I had fallen asleep at his house while watching a movie, so it was about 3 AM and I was exhausted. I knew the way to the parkway well enough, but I was still not that familiar with the particular part of town. As you get closer to the parkway, you have to actually cut through a park to get to the entrance ramp. That being said, there were very few lights and the nearest town wasn't far, but it was totally out of sight. I pulled onto the short road and I see a golden sedan stopped in the middle of the road. It was actually parked in such a way that you weren't able to go around it without a squeeze. For a little background, I'm very small. At the time I might have been about 100 pounds and I only stand at 5 foot tall. I slow my car down. I'm trying to see if I can see headlights coming from the other direction so I can pull around him, but before I could, this man turns and runs around the front side of his car. He's waving his arms about trying to get my attention. As I mentioned, I'm a small young girl, alone, and it's 3 AM. There was no way I'd stop him for this guy. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look scary, but alarms went off in my head. I tried to inch up so that way I could pass him, but he literally stands in the dead center of my car and he's not going to let me go. I quickly locked my car doors. And he stopped. He starts trying to talk to me, and now he's trying to make his way over to my window. My hearing isn't very good, but he was so close to me that I could read his lips. He was asking me for help. He wanted my cell phone to call someone. I said that I was very sorry, but no. He then got even closer to me and said please. I said no again, and I don't care if I run his foot over. I just left. I was starting to get scared. I was able to just barely pass, but had to do it slightly off-road onto the oncoming traffic lane. I look in my mirror and he's just standing in the middle of the road staring at me. I could see the anger in his face and my brake lights. I pulled into the right lane. As I did, my headlights catch 3 men climbing out of the bushes. They're all dressed in the same black t-shirts and jeans. Now they're all staring at me. I could just feel the radiating anger off of them. I gunned it and flew up the road and gone to the parkway. I could feel my whole body shaking. What had just happened? What were they going to do if I stopped? I pulled out my phone and called the police. They had to transfer me a few times because nobody could figure out if I should be talking to the county police or highway patrol. When I was finally able to reach someone to tell them what happened, they sent a car over to check it out. I had asked the officer to call me back and let me know if they found anybody. He later told me that by the time they got there, the men in the car were gone, and this isn't even 5 minutes after I spoke to the officer. Then another woman called in, same story as me, in that exact location. I was advised not to drive over by the park at night anymore. I had no idea that it was not that safe at the time, and I've never taken that exit since. Years ago, my mum told me about something that happened to her in college, and to this day, it's still one of the most horrifying things I can imagine ever waking up to. She still uses it to remind me to always be vigilant and lock my dorm room. Cue story. When my mum attended college, she lived in a regular student dorm, and back then security was basic. She had a roommate that would often come to her super late drunk and high and would forget to lock their dorm room. It annoyed my mum. It was one of those nights where her roomie came back late and passed out, forgotten to lock their door again. My mum is fast asleep, and with some instinct in her soul, she wakes up. She doesn't move though and feels weird, like she's being watched. And she somehow senses a presence nearby. She opens her eye and sees a shadowy figure of a man standing at the foot of her bed watching her, and there's something in his hands and it appears to be a knife. My mum jolts up in fear. The guy dashes out of their room just as my mum starts screaming. Terrified, they called the police to investigate to see what had happened. They discovered that the man had peed in several spots around the room. Now there's no way to tell if this was the first time that the guy had broken in or if he'd done it before. After that, her roommate always remembered to lock their door, and my mum slept with a knife under her pillow. One night when I was around 16, I received a call from an unknown number. Hello? And then heard heavy breathing and a click. I figured it was a wrong number and continued watching TV. I then got the same phone call again. Me. Hello? Then I heard heavy breathing. Who is this? A male voice then said, I know where you live. I started to panic a little and said, stop calling me, and hung up. As soon as I hung up, they called again. I ignored them about 5 or 6 more times when they tried calling again before finally answering. Me. I'm sure you're a prank caller, but please stop. The male voice. I'm in your house, followed by laughter, then a click. Every single hair on my body stood up as I crept to my door. Now my room was a renovated garage, so that means that the living room was directly to my right, and it opened up into the kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and stepped out to make sure that the doors were locked. The living room door was wide open. After about 10 seconds of being frozen in fear, I bolt to the knife block, grab the largest knife that I can, and quickly proceed to go throughout the house, turning on all of the lights as I went. I made it into my dad's room and shook him awake. I whisper, there's someone in the house. He immediately jumps up and grabbed the loaded revolver from under his drawer. He then slowly went throughout the house with his gun. I was close by him. He checked my closet, under my bed. As he was looking, I explained everything that had happened. He grabbed a flashlight and decided to look down our driveway. We live in the country and our driveway is very long. He shines the light down the driveway and suddenly takes off running, yelling, "Come back here now." Later, I found out that he had seen a man in a dark hoodie pop out of the bushes and started running down the driveway. He didn't catch him, and he never found out who it was or what they wanted.
So this happened about 6 months ago, and I recently took an Uber for the first time since this incident, so I thought I'd share. I was leaving a work function at a bar at midnight in a large city about an hour away from my suburban home I share with my partner. For reference, I'm a woman in my mid-20s with an average build, not tall, not strong, definitely not threatening in any way, and I was a bit buzzed that night. I'm talking like 3 drinks, so not incapacitated in the slightest. Anyway, I ordinarily take a company car home, but I hadn't reserved one since I didn't know what time I'd be leaving, so I just decided to Uber. The company reimbursed me with a bill anyway, so it was no difference to me. Once the Uber pulls up, I say goodbye to my colleagues and get in the back seat. I'm always very nice to my Uber drivers, so I introduce myself. This driver, let's call him Ed, I don't know his real name, seemed totally normal, no red flags, and we make pleasant conversation for about 15 minutes, until we are squarely out of the city on the way to the suburbs. From this pleasant conversation, I learned he lives in a certain neighbourhood not far from my house. Note that his neighbourhood, while relatively nearby, would be completely out of the way on the route we're taking to my home. The conversation reaches its natural end, so I stay quiet and start looking at my phone, Reddit, whatever. The quiet was interrupted by his voice, suggesting I can take a nap if I feel tired. It didn't even strike me as weird at first. I just thanked him for the offer, but I wasn't that tired. Then he said, "Oh, I always get sleepy when I'm drunk. Are you sure?" At this point, something in my body made me even more wide awake than before. I replied that I wasn't drunk, and like I'd said, I just had a few drinks, so no need to nap, haha. I'll be home soon enough anyway. He drops it after that, but I still thought it was weird. About 5 minutes later, he says that the highway has some weird construction going on, and that the single lane traffic ahead would make my trip way longer than it needs to be. He asks if it's okay to take another route. I oblige, already on edge, and just wanted to be home. My partner calls at that moment, asking when I'll be home, and I make sure to make it very clear that I was talking to my significant other. Something was weird about this guy, and I wanted him to know that someone is expecting me at a specific time, and knows where I am. After I hang up the phone, the Uber stays quiet and we get off the highway, on a different exit than I've ever used, but I guess that's to be expected on a different route home. I'm bullshitting on my phone because I don't want to talk to this guy anymore, not even looking up until he says, "My house is only 5 minutes from here." Okay, pit of my stomach. I'm probably a good 25 minutes away from my house now, a distance enlarged, I'd learn rather artificially, by his shortcut he took. I say some nonsense about how I like the neighbourhood, and how my boyfriend and I were thinking of moving here instead, blah blah, basically anything I can think of to make it seem like I didn't think this is weird, and I'm not picking up any signals. Surprisingly, he doesn't say anything in response, and now starts driving on a road in a direction I knew that led to my house. Phew, crisis averted, right? Except, not really. 15 minutes to go, and my surroundings were more familiar. Just as I'm starting to feel more at ease, he starts asking questions about my boyfriend. What does he do? How long you guys been together? And other seemingly normal questions. Finally, with about 10 minutes to go, he asks if my boyfriend makes me happy. He does, very much. So I gush a bit and say, yeah, he makes me very happy. Then he asks if I make him happy. I thought this was weird, but humour is my defence mechanism, so I say, well, I should hope so. 8 minutes away. He turns onto a side street and pulls over on the side of the road, looks back at me over the headrest and asks if I want to make him happy too. I said, what? Mostly because I can't believe what's happening. He asks again, do you want to make me happy tonight? I took a second to think through my options. I'm alone with this guy, who's behind the wheel. The street is dark and I don't see any lights on the nearby houses. It's close to 1 AM at this point on a weeknight, and I don't know what the hell this guy's in the car. I default to the response that many women know to be the true barrier to men's advances. I don't think my boyfriend would like that very much. His weird grin falls away from his face, and he says, he doesn't have to find out, come on, make me happy. I know a few ways you can start. I tell him my boyfriend expecting me home any minute, and besides, I love him, I don't want to hurt him, can you please just take me home? I carry a small knife and a little canister of mace, but all I could think was to appeal this guy's sensitive side. Somehow it worked and he didn't say another word after that, just turned back around and silently drove me home. Weirdly enough I say thanks as I get out of the car. Old habits die hard I guess, and that was that. I go into my house and start crying immediately for some reason, as soon as I hug my partner. He tells me I need to contact Uber immediately and tell them what happened, so that guy doesn't try to take any advances on anyone else. I agree and pull up the app and file a complaint. Except when I look at my last ride, the picture in the profile was 100% not the same guy who drove me home. The car was the same, but not the driver. The guy in the photo was brown, he wore a turban, maybe early 40s. The guy who drove me home was white. He seemed to be a bit older than me. Uber never followed up with me, they just refunded my money. I did tell the police what happened because my partner insisted, but they didn't take me seriously since nothing actually happened. I was worried for a while since the guy knew where I lived, but apparently it's long forgotten since I just took an Uber today. Moral of the story, always make sure the photo in your Uber driver's profile matches the person who's driving the car.